We'll start. Thank you so much to everyone who is joining us today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome. My name is Isabel. I am a co-author of the report we're here to discuss today and a senior researcher in the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre's Labour Rights team. Just as we begin, a couple of housekeeping notes. Today's conversation is on the record. It is open. We are recording it. Please do feel free to think about and discuss anything you hear today with your respective teams and organisations and to share in other fora as well. We are also monitoring, and we do encourage you to use the chat function today to share comments and reflections as we go through the conversation. We will have a Q&A session at the end as well, so please do feel free to share questions as we go through, and my colleague Katrina will be collecting those up. Any issues with sound, please message one of the panelists or all of the panelists and hosts, and we will do what we can to help you. Joining me today are Shika Suleiman Batajaji and Geoffrey Otieno from Equidem, here to speak to the findings of their team's work to document from migrant workers themselves in the UAE, their experiences of recruitment and working and living conditions while being deployed to wind and solar projects in the country. We're also combining in this report that research with two pieces from the Resource Centre. Firstly, an industry mapping which we undertook to identify solar, wind and green hydrogen production facilities across the Gulf, as well as the private sector stakeholders involved in developing, constructing, supplying parts and services or financing those projects. That is publicly available and we will be sharing that with you later today. And then secondly, we undertook an assessment of a sampled 27 companies identified through the mapping as being particularly key to the expansion of renewable energy in the region. And what we really wanted to do with this report was to set the scene, define a baseline against which we can push for better working conditions in what is a quickly unfolding renewable energy industry for the region. Just a decade ago, there were next to zero renewable energy projects in the region, and today we've tracked 75 projects that are either operational now, are under construction or are planned to come online before 2030, which is now only 6 years away. We know that net zero targets and renewable energy targets must be urgently expanded to combat the climate crisis, but at present we find several areas where the industry falls short in identifying and protecting against risk to migrant workforces in their value chain. There are over 24 million migrant workers in the Gulf region who are all the more noticeable for their absence in the policies, the risk assessments, the due diligence processes of the companies that we assessed and their human rights policies, their just transition planning commitments. We know that this transition cannot come soon enough, but at present it is set to come at the expense of some of the world's most vulnerable workers. And with that, I will hand over to Geoffrey, firstly to briefly introduce himself, and then perhaps Geoffrey to start with a bit of an overview of what the team found in the investigation. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Lucy, and good morning, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this important session. And my name is Geoffrey Otieno, a former migrant worker and now a human rights activist and senior investigator with Equidem. I have been with Equidem for the past 4 years, fighting for migrant worker rights. I work to amplify their voices and bring much needed reforms to protect migrant worker rights across the regions. I have personally experienced the harsh realities faced by migrant workers, having spent over 4 years in Qatar, working as a migrant worker in the construction and occupational health sectors. During that time, I endured severe violations of my rights, which ignited my commitment to fighting for the dignity and safety of workers who continue to suffer under similar conditions. Between February and November 2023 and April and June 2024, Equidem investigators, who are mostly migrant workers, conducted research on UAE's renewable sector. We interviewed 34 workers from South Asia and Africa, including 4 solar and wind farms in UAE, employed by 10 major renewable energy developers, which included workers from 14 subcontracted companies providing services such as security, construction, installation, delivery, and facilities management. Accessing workers in the field was a challenge, as these solar parks are often in locations difficult to reach and access by design. Because if you look at the Gulf region itself, how they locate their industrial cities, they're always in the outskirts of the city, whereby it's a challenge for even workers to reach those areas, or even investigators to reach those areas, because mostly the mode of transport is by company buses. So it was not an easy task, especially for our investigators, to reach to these solar parks. This is in addition to the general fear
I think we've temporarily lost Joffrey. Is it just myself, or can others also not hear or see him? No problem. We'll just wait a moment. Otherwise, I might hand over to Shika for you to pick up on Joffrey's presentation, if that's okay. Great. Joffrey, you're back. We can see you. You're just on mute at the moment, and then I'm sure we'll be able to hear you.
Sorry, there was a power outage.
No problem at all. No problem at all.
So,
back to you.
Yeah, so I was at where it was not easy to access workers in the field. And just as I said, this is an issue, in addition to the general fear of retaliation and even deportation that workers have when being asked to share information about their employers. Despite this, 34 brave workers still came forward to share their experiences, and their testimony provides a window into the abuse and exploitation that remains hidden behind the glitzy image of the renewable energy sector in the UAE. During these investigations, Equidem documented 10 out of 11 forced labor indicators, which included abuse of vulnerability, deception, this restriction of movement, physical and sexual violence, intimidation and threats, holding identity documents, which is a normal cause, withholding of wages, abusive living conditions, which workers reported overcrowded and hygienic accommodations and insufficient food to meet their nutritional needs. They also experienced abusive working conditions whereby workers were exposed to heat stress and suffering health impacts such as heat stroke and rashes. And there was also race and nationality-based discrimination under those abusive conditions. And finally, and not least, excessive overtime. Workers regularly described working between 60 to 72 hours a week. And in one case, a worker reported working up to 84 hours a week. In addition, workers reported paying illegal recruitment fees ranging from USD 250 to 1,300 USD, which of course is unethical. The most powerful and emblematic testimony for me came from an Indian national working in a solar equipment. He said, and I quote, "The company treats all the workers like animals. There's a lot of work here, and there's shortage of workers. I work for 12 hours a day. If I do my work comfortably, the work will not be finished. And if the work is not finished, the supervisor will shout at me. Even my salary can be cut. There's so much work that I do not even get a minute of rest." End of quote. You can imagine if a worker can share that kind of experience, considering my personal experience, especially as an occupational and a health safety inspector, which I worked in during my time in Qatar. That really made me feel so bad, because this was the same experience that workers were facing during my stay and work in the GCC. So this related so much with what I experienced, what other workers experienced, and it made me feel so bad and so helpless. This is just one example to show the humanizing conditions these workers face. That is all too familiar for me personally. Just as I've told you, I used to work as a safety inspector pre-World Cup in Qatar 2022. And I would naturally stop the work as a professional safety officer during peak hours of humidity due to heat stress, which was clearly explained in the permit to work. But we would be pressurized to let work continue due to unrealistic work completion targets, which threw caution of protecting workers out of the window. The presence of forced labor indicators across the renewable energy sectors in the UAE is not only a violation of workers' rights, but a serious setback in the global fight for ethical and sustainable development. Governments, developers, and stakeholders must act now to ensure that the energy transition is both fast and fair. We must work together to reform labor policies, enforce existing laws, and create safe, dignified work environment for all workers, regardless of their nationality or immigration status. These workers' testimonies speak directly to the needs for private stakeholders and governments to ensure an environment where work is dignified and rights respecting, a guarantee that the transition to renewable energy is not only fast, but also fair. That's my own brief of the findings, but I would like to put this question as I hand over back to EC. These findings are emblematic of the situations across the region, where and for which companies should the workers' testimony and risk of abuse be of most concern? And secondly, what does the Gulf Energy Explorer intend to do?
Thanks so much.
Thank you, and back to EC.
Thanks, Geoffrey, and thanks for setting the scene really vividly and so well. I think that's a really great point for me to pick up on, because we've just heard from yourself about the egregious nature of the abuses that workers are currently experiencing on a regular basis, and that question of which companies is this relevant to is the one that we really wanted to start answering with our Gulf Energy Explorer, which you can see screenshots of on the screen now. It was really vital for us to start by looking at the businesses that are choosing to enter into development agreements for renewable projects in the region. And these are the companies for whom these abuses should be of the most concern. And really, the Gulf Energy Explorer has two main purposes. Firstly, we want to strengthen corporate transparency in renewable energy value chains by providing a resource for our audiences, for civil society, many of whom I can see attending today's call, for investors and for policymakers to be able to access information on renewable energy projects and the companies profiting from them. But the second purpose was really to improve corporate accountability for the abuses that you've just described by identifying which renewable energy actors were particularly key, and to be able to articulate to those stakeholders specifically where there may be risks for the migrant workforces linked to their renewable value chains, and ensure, as you say, safe, dignified work for all of those workers. So we took and we used publicly available information to record information on the type of project. So whether the projects are solar, wind, green hydrogen, where they're located in the Gulf, the capacity, the capability of those projects to produce energy, and other information on, for example, investment types. So far we've tracked 75 projects, which you can see on the map on the left-hand side of the slide, which are either already operational, under construction, or planned to come online in the next 6 years. Most projects are solar projects. You can see there's a particular concentration of projects in the UAE and Saudi Arabia especially, followed by green hydrogen projects, and then wind projects, which have the smallest contribution to the region's energy capacity and energy production. On average, we found that each project is looking at an investment of 1.4 billion US dollars, but we also found that investments in the projects varied quite considerably, between sort of under $100 million at the lower end to over 8 billion US dollars, and that was for the Neom Green Hydrogen project, for example. In total, we have identified and linked over 180 companies to the 75 projects as energy developers, contractors, but also parts suppliers, companies offering professional services, advisors, and financing as well. And most of those companies, around 2/3, are headquartered outside of the region. So we're looking at a highly international market with companies headquartered across Europe, the Asia Pacific region, and the USA. I would say particular interest in the projects has come from companies headquartered in the Asia Pacific region, particularly Chinese EPC contractors, engineering, procurement and construction contractors, and parts suppliers, perhaps reflecting the sort of increased pace of growth of Chinese overseas investment, that's globally, but also as well sort of increasing economic ties between China and the GCC, because energy has been selected, we know, as a priority industry for collaboration between the region and China. Also seeing a lot of interest in the projects from Japanese, Indian and Australian companies, but also European companies, and you can see some of that on the right-hand side. I'm just going to quickly take everyone through the Explorer. So Jason, if you wouldn't mind just stopping sharing the slides, and I will share my screen quickly. The Explorer itself sits on the Resource Centre's website, and in that sense, it's built into our database, as many of our pieces of work are. And it sits on a new homepage we've created for this project specifically. So if you are interested in information being gathered on this topic, this would be where to go. And the database itself, let me zoom in slightly. Oh, that's maximum, I think. Sits in two different ways, and you can explore the data either by thinking about the projects or by thinking about the companies that are involved in their development. The map that we have here is exploratory. We do encourage everyone to have a go and see how they find the data. You can use the legend on the left-hand side to narrow down specifically to look at a particular type of energy. So you can see here that I can see only the wind projects, for example, but I can easily add back up the solar and green hydrogen projects that are also, as we've described, those three phases of project cycle. You can also hover over each of the icons to get a little snapshot of what the project is, where it is, the type of project it is, and what phase it's in. And if I were to click, I get an expansion of that project. So each project comes with a little blurb describing who's delivering the project, the size of the project, the information on the investment that we've been able to see has been publicly reported in that project, as well as the companies that are linked. From here, I can also see more information about the companies by clicking the company links. And for those who maybe aren't as familiar, the Resource Centre hosts over 10,000 now company pages on our website, which collect information on specific companies. So for the Total page, for example, you can see that we've reached out to them 51 times. They have an almost 100% response rate, which means that they've given us information almost 100% of the time when we've brought concerns of human rights abuse to them. You can also see that they feature in 2 of our other databases that we host on the Resource Centre website. This project is under construction, so we only have a little bit of information on the stakeholders involved, but for some of the projects which are already operational, there is more information. Again, a bit of blurb, the rest of the data as I've just talked through, but then far more information on, for example, the financing. And this particular project, you can see, has a lot of local financing, some international advisors here, a local environmental, social and impact advisor, as well as a similar advisor headquartered in the UK. We also have a contractor that's been appointed by the development consortium. And again, if you want to look for more information on those companies, you can do so from the tracker. Looking at the companies that we have in the tracker, these are organised, maybe if I just refresh, that would be quicker. These are organised by country of headquarter of the companies that we have in the database. So you can see here that organised by number of projects or by capacity of the projects in megawatts that the companies are involved in. Saudi Arabia is coming up top. Companies headquartered in Saudi Arabia have been awarded work 86 times in one of those capacities on the projects. And so you can start to see for whom and for which countries of headquarters this data and the abuses that Geoffrey described to us to start the session would be of most relevance. Likewise, you can also search for companies. You can also expand these views if you want to see, for example, this was EDF, which projects EDF is involved in. I can toggle here to show the different sizes of those projects. So obviously that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 projects for EDF, a particularly large one, and then others a little bit smaller. And I can also look at information on each of those projects in much the same way as we started off. I'm going to stop sharing now, and if we could go back to the second slide, please, Jason, that would be very helpful. But what I think those examples sort of showed, and this is also seen on the screen now in the blue box where it says project company, we see time and time again that these projects are being developed by consortia, by joint ventures, by special purpose vehicles that are formed usually between at least 1 or 2 local energy developers or contractors and energy developers or another contractor headquartered outside of the region. And at present, a large unknown for us is the manner in which these entities are being entered into, the business relationships, how they're being formed, how standards are being upheld. And we know from work done by colleagues elsewhere at the Resource Centre who also have worked on renewables that, for example, when issues regarding land rights have come to the fore in relation to a renewable energy project, a particular issue has been in identifying which entity has ultimate control over the project, who should be responsible for upholding standards or remedying them. I think thinking more broadly about those business relationships and about the sort of opacity of the information on who is operating on which project. Something we find at the Resource Centre is that our success rate for engagement with companies headquartered in the GCC is significantly lower than for companies headquartered globally when we look at the global average. So on average, we have a response rate of around 63% of companies will reach out to them, will respond to us, but in the Gulf, that falls to about 26% on average. And in addition to that, these smaller companies are often untraceable, they are uncontactable, they may not have a web presence, they may be acting as a holding company for other entities. There's very little public information on how those business relationships or structures are come about. And so all of this adds up to create an environment where it is easier for human rights abuse to proliferate, while civil society stakeholders, again, many of whom I know are on the call, are limited in how we can hold those companies to account. And I think these are all concerns that should really speak to the renewable energy industry already operating in the region and those looking to expand into the region. These are risks that really need to be at the forefront of any business making decisions. And I think before I hand over to Shika, I think one particular observation that came about as in the progress of this research and as we were starting with this collaboration, which was really interesting, was that this industry mapping was highly revealing that the extent to which the companies that were employing the workers that Geoffrey has spoken about their experiences already, those companies were entirely hidden. We couldn't map any public links between the companies that were named by workers as being their direct employers and the renewable energy projects that we've been able to track in our database. And there was no transparency on those business relationships. And without the research that the Equidem team has undertaken, it simply would not have been possible to know which companies were mistreating workers or where those workers were being placed. And that was a particular challenge, but a finding that came out through the process of undertaking the research for the investigating team. And so my question to Shika is, obviously that's one particular challenge, but what other challenges did you uncover when carrying out the research, and what did that mean for the challenges in holding the industry to account for the migrant worker abuses?
Thanks so much, Isabel. There's two dimensions of accountability challenges that I'd like to talk through today. One is, and both of them are actually inherent to the structure of this industry. And so on pointing out these particular challenges, they should be considered by business actors as particular risks associated with not only working in the renewable sector, but also heightened by working in the renewable sector in the Gulf. And the first risk is something that Geoffrey also mentioned in his opening discussion and opening remarks, which is that we have issues inherent to the location of where renewable projects are located that lead to extreme isolation of workers. So large solar and wind parks, based on their scale, based on their size, based on the type of energy that's being produced in these areas, are systematically moved away from population centers. And so workers move from company-owned dormitories to projects and back, and are pretty much entirely cut off from population centers where they may be able to interact with advocates, with actually embassies, with anyone who may be able to assist them. And so the challenges in the research that Geoffrey described are actually a microcosm of what workers would face in reporting or seeking relief in cases of rights violations. And what that actually does is it creates a culture of impunity, because even if workers are facing mistreatment, that mistreatment takes place behind closed doors, behind high levels of surveillance. And even when our team members who were systematically going and approaching sites, looking to speak to workers in dormitories, in housing areas, they weren't able to get access even when they were looking for workers to speak to. And that is true both for large solar projects and wind parks. And the other thing that we're seeing as a trend in terms of green hydrogen projects, especially in Oman, is that these look like they're going to be progressively located in special economic zones, for instance, in Duqm, to facilitate export. And there you have both the exclusions associated with special economic zones being geographically, physically removed from population centers, but you also have heightened risks further associated with labor law exclusions. So that cluster of risks, which I'm discussing as location-related challenges that lead to isolation, are a risk factor that businesses really need to take into account in developing robust mechanisms to ensure that there are reporting systems and there are labor and human rights monitoring on renewables projects. The second dimension of accountability challenges that I'd like to point to actually have to do with the structure of the industry and the structure of monopsony relationships on renewable labor supply chains. Now, what do I mean by monopsony relationships? A monopoly relationship is when you have a single buyer and multiple companies that are looking to provide services to that buyer. A monopsony is similar in how it functions in terms of concentration of power, but instead of one monopoly actor, you have a number of monopsony actors. So a monopsony is a relationship in which you have a powerful actor who can actually source from multiple less powerful actors. And so how does that play out on renewable labor supply chains? You have the monopsony power in the lead firms, and they actually hire from multiple labor suppliers in delivery, construction, maintenance, and security. And the big firms are not hiring systematically through a vertically integrated structure where they're always working with the same labor suppliers. In fact, they have unstable employment relationships between lead firms and the labor suppliers that lead to what we discuss in the report as fragmented labor supply chains. And so just to give you an example, of the 10 renewable companies investigated by Equidem researchers, they systematically hired from a web of 14 shared contractors. So the companies are hiring from a same group of shared subcontractors. And these are the contractors that Izzy was mentioning are particularly hard to even identify on the public record. They also share highly exploitative labor practices. Now, what do you have when you have this sort of monopsony relationship? The lead firms, they're sourcing workers from a number of different suppliers. You have workers who are hired by contractors who actually move between lead firms and projects on a regular and ongoing basis. So in that regard, the labor supply chains between lead firms and their workers are unstable. And an unstable labor supply chain is difficult to make transparent and even more difficult to monitor. It also undermines accountability because workers don't have a direct employment relationship with the lead firms. Further, as workers are moving through subcontractors across projects, it's harder for them to take collective action and work together to challenge injustice. Now, why does this structure persist? Because it's advantageous to lead firms. It's advantageous to lead firms in at least two ways. One is that it lowers costs because competition between labor suppliers actually drives down costs. But in driving down costs, they also drive down working conditions. So if you have subcontractors bidding to provide services and provide workers at the least possible cost, where do you see the contractors recovering those gains? They actually shift the burden onto workers. That's where you have overcrowded accommodations, extended working hours, because they need to make the pool of, they need to extract labor from workers for a greater amount of work than is actually being paid for. You also have risk displacement. So labor rights violations take place at the level of the supplier. There are very few direct hires by lead firms, and these suppliers are nowhere on the public record. So the advantages that lead firms have then is that they're able to lower costs through the system and also displace risk. As Isabel mentioned, there's a heightened risk when the monopsony players are state-owned GCC companies, because there's another level at which the ownership of these companies by autocratic monarchies undermines accountability. So just in terms of the type of structural solutions we would need to see, in addition to a robust risk assessment, standards for labor contractors, is we really need to be moving towards a system of vertical integration where there are stable relationships with labor contractors who can provide in turn stable employment to workers. Stable margins will lead to better working conditions. And as soon as there's a vertically integrated public relationship between lead firms and subcontractors, we'll actually be in a position where we can move towards transparency and accountability in a really different way. So with that, I will pass back to Isabel.
Thanks, Shika. And I think we can go to the final slide, please, Jason, when you have a second. We want to finish by talking through some of the core recommendations that we make in the report and some of the calls. We've talked a lot about some of the barriers to that they both sort of inherent in the industry, the risks that our workers experience as set up through their employment relationships, through their experience of unfair recruitment. And so we do include in the report some foundational recommendations to energy developers and contractors who have the most resources and the greatest leverage to affect change and to improve conditions for workers. I'm just going to run through these 5 that we have on the screen now and also talk a little bit about how these speak to the gaps that we saw when we carried out the assessment that I mentioned at the beginning of the 27 developers and contractors that were particularly at the forefront of this expansion. The first has to be around just transition planning. We've heard a lot about a just transition. It's becoming a buzz phrase, but it's rooted in and it comes out of the global labour movement, which has stated consistently and with increasing urgency that social dialogue, as facilitated through preferably mandated union representatives from anywhere from a global to local level, is absolutely central to achieving a just transition for everyone, and that a just transition cannot happen without the meaningful involvement of workers. And so what we were doing here was to assess those companies based on publicly available information on what they were, how they were centering workers in their just transition planning, what their commitments looked like. And what we found was really quite woeful. In relation to just transition planning specifically, only 3 of those companies committed publicly to engage in social dialogue. And this is something which is especially important for this region, where, of course, freedoms of association, of assembly, and to unionize are particularly restricted. So we also looked, for example, to see whether companies had a commitment to recognize risks to workers in contexts where worker organizing is limited. And again, only 3 companies recognize that right for workers to join equivalent worker bodies where union rights are restricted under local law. We also saw only 3 companies had entered into a global framework agreement with the relevant global union. And again, this agreement negotiated at a global level between a multinational company and trade union is absolutely essential, no more so than in the Gulf context, where unionizing is particularly restricted on the ground for workers. And just to finish off, we also saw a real lack of recognition of migrant workers as a stakeholder to be engaged by companies, particularly in terms of their just transition planning. So we do call in the report for that commitment to social dialogue with unions, to social dialogue with alternative structures where they do exist, and consulting with key stakeholders. And that means civil society. It also means for this region diaspora groups who are often on the forefront of providing support and aid to workers who are being abused. Secondly, value chain transparency. Just heard from Shika, how fragmented the industry is, how unstable the value chain is, the sort of transient nature of workers deployed on short-term contracts to projects, the challenges that posed not just to investigators, but also for workers themselves, all because those business relationships are, as she said, advantageous to lead firms. But it's absolutely essential for that to be considered, those impacts to be considered by those workers. And what we found, our indicator for this was to review supplier codes of conduct as a sort of first port of call for applying and implementing binding standards. And what we found was that almost every company actually, I think it was 24 out of 27 companies, did have a supplier code of conduct. Really disappointingly, only 2/3 of those were aligned with ILO standards. So you have a situation where potentially the standards being upheld, if they are being implemented, are lower than they should be. And so really what we call for companies to do is to acknowledge the heightened risk that their own operations, their consortia, business relationships, their heavy reliance on subcontracting, outsourcing, an unstable value chain, the heightened risk that poses directly to migrant workers. A first step would be a commitment to increase transparency on those business partnerships for projects where they are a lead developer, a contractor, and that means disclosing names of contractors, subcontractors, labour suppliers, agencies. It should be their business to know who is providing the outsourced services and subcontracting the workers that Joffrey and Shika have described through the employment relationships that were uncovered by the Equidem team. But that isn't publicly available at the moment. That has to be our first step to transparency. We also call for robust and improved and sensitised human rights due diligence commensurate with the risk that is being posed by these operations to migrant workers. And that means adopting a migrant worker-centred approach to identifying where workers are at risk, really engaging with them. I think one thing we saw coming out of the assessment was that companies would often mention consulting with workers. What that meant in practice was a survey, a worker survey. That is not an initiative, it's an information gathering exercise that might be of use within that company's overall risk assessment, but it is not an exercise intended to build worker power in a region where that is absolutely essential. So robust and thorough human rights due diligence, and as part of that, ensuring clarity on the roles and responsibilities across projects for the different entities. And this kind of refers back to what I was saying about the example of land rights on renewables projects. We know that this is a barrier to pinpointing exactly who in the entity is actually responsible for setting standards and for remediating harms, and that has to be another first step. Fair recruitment, I think many of the people on this call have worked on fair recruitment issues to some extent. We saw no company align publicly with the employer pays principle, which is the international standard for fair recruitment. We saw only a third of companies explicitly prohibit worker paid fees and recognise that as a risk. For this region where we know that so many workers arrive burdened with debt from having been charged fees, whether legally or illegally, extortionately, this has to be a number one issue to be addressed. And so, firstly, a commitment to prohibit worker charged fees, and secondly, an alignment with the employer pays principle would be really welcome. And then finally, redress and remedy. We know that, as Joffrey sort of described, we know that workers it's extremely difficult for workers to speak up. And so in that sense, it's absolutely essential for companies to be responding proactively when concerns are raised, to commit to remedy abuse within best practice principles. And that means consultatively with workers or their representatives, quickly as possible, and to ensure no further harm, transparent communication. But I think as well, and again, this speaks to the findings that Joffrey described, ensuring protections for whistleblowers and labour rights defenders has to be absolutely essential in a region where we know that threat is held over workers' heads as a reason to stop them speaking up. So before we go to the Q&A, I just want to finish off quickly by referring back to the foreword from the report. So for those who haven't yet seen the report itself, we were lucky to have a foreword included by Julia Lagana, who is the co-director of the Just Transition Centre at the International Trade Union Confederation. And I do urge you to read that foreword. I think it's absolutely fantastic, but she makes two very key points that I just want to draw on. The first is that the Just Transition as a concept has long been called for by the trade union, the global trade union movement, and the importance of placing workers at the centre of efforts to transform, as she says, polluting industries to create new, cleaner ones. The green jobs movement, good green jobs, is absolutely essential. But for this to happen, we have to ensure that migrant workers or worker representatives have a seat at the table with governments and with business, crucially. And that's something that all companies we've assessed and that we've included in the tracker should take note of. And the second thing that she says is that we stand at a unique moment now in the evolution of a global energy system, and we do have an opportunity to deliver on the promise of a just transition for some of the most vulnerable workers. She says that's possible and it's imperative. And that is something which, for both of our organisations, we will continue to work on. This is a priority for both Equidem and the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre to look at an industry in a region that perhaps hasn't yet been the focal point for rights organisations focused on the Gulf, but which nonetheless, certainly can't rest on its laurels in assuming that all the jobs it will create are good jobs without those fundamental principles aligning with workers' rights. We're going to now go to the Q&A session. I can actually see we've had a couple of comments in there already, but I just want to flag for those who haven't seen, we do have the Q&A section open, and we will happily take questions. I'm just going to let people find that in case they have some, and pause for a moment. And Kat, I will hand over to you to facilitate that Q&A. And for those who joined late, sorry, just to say the QR on the screen, the QR on the screen at the moment should take you to the report itself if you haven't seen it already. Thanks, Kat.
Thanks so much, Isabel. Thanks, Shika and Joffrey, for those great presentations. So we do currently have 2 questions in the Q&A function. And yes, I encourage others in the audience to pose any questions or comments that you have in there. The first question is from Claire Coomer. I think, Isabel, you will probably be best placed to answer this one. So the question says, we're also worried about this in a European geography and are looking at migrant workers' contribution to the green transition in the context of big labour shortages. Have we looked at what European companies are doing within their European-based renewable projects? And do we have any plans to research this in the future? So yes, Isabel, over to you.
Sorry, I was still on mute. Thanks, Claire, and thanks very much for your interest. So we do at the Resource Centre have a natural resources and just energy transition team. They have 2 particularly sort of flagship products, and then we're also supported by regional teams who also themselves produce regional briefings much along the same lines that we did. In terms of research that might be of interest to yourselves, I would flag our renewable energy and human rights benchmark. The last one came out in 2023, I think it was around this time, perhaps a week earlier in 2023, and that essentially looks at scoring 28 key publicly traded companies in the wind and solar sector. We have our methodology and our scores individually for each of those companies available. I don't have the precise numbers in front of me, but certainly many of those companies are European headquartered. We had, I think it was around 10 European headquartered companies included in the assessment that we undertook for this report. And I would point you to that as a first resource on that. In terms of a European focus, I think a European focus has largely looked at the impacts of transition mining. So rather than being the end of the sort of project end of the value chain, really looking at the extraction of the raw materials that are absolutely crucial for the transition to renewable energy. And that has looked at conditions in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So I'm not aware at present of any specific projects in Europe, but it's certainly something I think we'd be interested to do more on. So if you are doing anything like that yourself, please feel free to reach me after the session, and I'll also happily share links to those pieces of research that might be of interest. Thanks, Kat.
Great, thanks so much, Isabel. The second question is from Manju Gurang. So he is asking if we have any more information about grievance mechanisms for workers. I do think Joffrey or Shika, you may be best placed to answer this one. Perhaps you can speak to some of the difficulties workers have reporting grievances in the region.
Thank you very much for that. Ideally, this is one very important question, and it's not easy, yes, but as an organization which influences policy and exposes injustice and, of course, comes up with practical solutions, we are working, especially on advocacy, to pressurize the respective governments, especially from the receiving countries and the sending countries, to strengthen the bilateral trade agreements they have, because definitely it is not working. The law is so good on paper, but in reality, workers are not able to access justice. And this is due to fear of reprisal or retaliation from employers. So it means that those laws are mostly pro employers, whereby workers feel threatened when they report such injustices. So there's need to work around those laws to make it more accommodative to workers. And this can only start from the negotiating part, from the sending country to the destination country. So we are looking at working around those policies whereby these laws can be worker friendly. Then access to justice can also be easily accessible. We even prefer a digital way whereby workers can anonymously complain against certain companies, if that will guarantee their safety. Because just as we've seen in our research, we are trying to protect so much the workers who are speaking, definitely because of the security aspects of it. I think that that way of doing things can also be worked around, especially on how workers can complain confidently. Because only when these matters or these challenges come out is when solutions can be found. But if workers continue fearing to speak about these challenges they are going through, it will be so difficult for actors like us to come up with solutions to those challenges. So that is something that we are looking at, but mostly it's a policy issue which has to be addressed from both sending country and the destination country. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Joffrey. Shika, do you have anything to add to that at all?
I think just one challenge to highlight that persists is that the direct employment relationship is between workers and the labor contractors. The labor contractors are also to whom workers' visas are tied. And so in some ways, avenues to relief are also disrupted in the same way as accountability channels more broadly. And so where workers are bound to a particular subcontractor and move from project to project, the stability of grievance mechanisms and channels currently are not in a position that they're able to adequately reach the actual labor force. And this is a huge risk for business actors in the region, especially ones incorporated in states where we have emerging human rights due diligence legislation. And we hope that by exposing these risks and bringing them to the attention of business actors, it will really catalyze a deep interest in accountability for labor rights in general, which includes the type of grievance mechanisms that Manju refers to. That's a great question. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. We don't have any further questions in the chat, but if anyone does have any questions they would like to ask us, our email contacts are on the screen, so please do get in touch. I'll now pass back over to Isabel to close. Thank you.
Thanks, Kat. Before we do that, I just want to check, Mustafa, whether you would like to say any closing remarks before we close, because we do have a little bit of time.
Thanks, Izzy. Yeah, I'm very happy to very briefly speak. Firstly, thank you to the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, Isabel and Katrina, and also to my Equidem colleagues, and of course the workers and others that we spoke to do this really important research. I think what this shows is not just the really glaring deficiencies of the Gulf renewable sector, but the opportunities that are there to actually have a truly just transition in that region. You know, we know well that the Gulf is one of the most deeply impacted areas of the planet when it comes to climate change. According to the science, in the next 50 or so years, the region will be uninhabitable. So it is very logical to be transitioning to a renewable sector, and as soon as possible, given especially that the Gulf itself is a huge contributor in terms of CO2 emissions. And yet, sadly, what our research has shown, with the combined power of expertise of Equidem with its worker researchers and experts, and with the resource center's experts and analysis, is that there are huge areas for improvement. Just to go over some of the points that others have mentioned, only a little over half of the 27 sample companies published a human rights policy aligning with international standards, and under half explicitly recognized migrant workers' vulnerability. Alarmingly, no company publicly aligned with the international standard on fair recruitment, also known as the employer pays principle. And of the companies contacted, none outlined how they support worker representation. to really emphasize to everyone, what we're talking about here are very low thresholds when it comes to labor protection. These are things that can be addressed and they must be addressed in a situation, as we're seeing with the global headlines, of profound volatility in that region. So again, just to really emphasize that point, that the report documents these very big concerns in this sector, but crucially, it also provides very concrete recommendations. And so my one takeaway to everyone today who has joined our launch is that we need your support to be talking to your stakeholders, talking to businesses and governments about the need to not shut out the Gulf, but to be having these honest discussions about what's happening. We've seen with the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer doing a trade missions to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and also looking to finalize a Gulf Cooperation Council trade deal. Many other advanced economies are trying to do similar things as well with the Gulf. What we are saying is not to have these deals, but that they have to be predicated on respect for human rights and labor rights. I'll leave it there, but just to say again, thank you so much to the Resource Centre and to my Equidem colleagues. It's been really great to launch the report today. Back to you, Isabel.
Thanks, Mustafa. And I think we can close with a minute to go. Sharing my own thanks to the Equidem team and also everyone working behind the scenes, Jason, Deepika, and Rameshwar, to make today's event happen, and also to many of our colleagues across the movement who I know joined us today. If you are a business and you are joining today, just to flag that we will be having a closed-door industry discussion on the report in the new year. If we haven't already been in touch with you or your business and you would be interested in joining that and learning more, please do reach out to us directly. And of course, for anyone else who wishes to do so as well. I think we'll sign off there. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your days.